This is the second video on comparing fractions, and in this video we're going to look at how to compare fractions that are 1 unit fraction away from 1 whole, and we're also going to compare fractions to a half. Sometimes we call that benchmarking fractions to a half in order to compare a pair of fractions. We need to quickly review unit fractions. And again, unit fractions are any fraction that have 1 as their numerator. So they have exactly one piece. And you can see here, this is a piece of work that one of my students completed earlier in the year. As our denominators increase, the size of the piece is getting smaller. 1/12 is much smaller than 1/2. So we always need to keep that in mind. The larger the denominator is, the more pieces I'm cutting that 1 whole into. And so the pieces will be smaller. Here we're going to compare two fractions that are exactly 1 unit fraction away from 1. If we look at our first fraction, 2/3, we can see that that is 1/3 away from 1 whole. And 7/8 is exactly 1/8 away from 1 whole. So one thing I like to do is I like to think about what piece is missing, so the 1/3 and the 1/8, and then I think which one of those would be greater. Well, I know that the bigger the denominator, the smaller my piece is. So 1/3 is going to be greater. So this fraction is going to have the greater piece missing. So if it has the greater piece missing, then it must be the smaller fraction. So you can see we have an inverse relationship between the two fractions I'm comparing and then the piece that they're missing from being 1 whole. Let me explain that one more time using the diagrams below. If I have 2/3, we can shade this in here, you can see that the piece that's missing is 1/3. And in 7/8, we have just about everything here shaded in, and there's only 1/8 that's missing. So you can see that this 1/8 piece is much smaller than the missing piece would be over here of 1/3. And that is why 7/8 is greater. We're going to compare two fractions by comparing each of them to 1/2. So if I'm looking at the fractions 2/5 and 5/8, and I can see that both of them are kind of close to a half, we know that if I had fifths, and I've got 2/5 here, if I was to divide the fifths in half, I would have 2.5 circles. So that would be equivalent to 1/2. So I know that 2/5 is just less than a half. Now looking at 5/8, I can draw 8 circles. And I would have 5 of them shaded in, because that's my numerator. And if I wanted to know what half would be, half of 8 is 4. So only 4 of those would be equivalent to 1/2. And I can see that 5/8 is just greater than 1/2. So just by comparing each of my fractions to 1/2, I can see that 5/8 is greater than 2/5. Now let's use those two strategies that we just learned, comparing fractions to 1/2 and looking at fractions that are 1 unit away from a whole, to compare these 4 sets of fractions. Let's look at the first one, 2/5 and 4/7. I can see that both of these are somewhat close to 1/2. So if I'm looking at 2/5, I could draw 5 circles, shade in 2 of them, and then I could think, okay, if I was to divide the 5 circles in half, that would be right here. So 2/5 is going to be just less than a half. And then let's look at 4/7. 4 of those would be shaded, and the halfway point would be in the middle of that 4th circle. So I know that 4/7 is just greater than a half, which makes it the greater fraction. Let's look over at 11/12 and 10/11. I can see right away that these are both 1 unit fraction away from 1 whole. This one is 1/12 away from a whole, and this one is 1/11 away from a whole. So I need to think, okay, my two missing pieces, which one of those is greater? Well, since this one over here, 1/12, has a greater denominator, I know that that's going to be my smaller piece. So 1/11, that's the bigger piece that's missing. So if 10/11 has a greater piece that's missing, then 11/12 is the larger fraction. Let's look down at 7/8 and 8/9. This is also one of our 1 unit fraction away from a whole problems. So we can write what unit fraction is missing. 1/8 is missing from 7/8 to be a complete 1 whole. 1/9 is missing from 8/9 to be a complete 1 whole. So the bigger the denominator, the smaller the piece. I know that 1/8 is greater than 1/9. That's my bigger missing part. So the fractions have the exact opposite relationship. They have an inverse relationship. 8/9 is going to be greater than 7/8 because it has a smaller piece missing. And let's look at our last set of fractions. This is a great set to compare to 1/2. This time I'm going to do it without drawing any circles. Let's think about 2/6. How many sixths would I need to make 1/2? 3/6 would be equivalent to 1/2. I know that 2/6 is going to be less than that. So 2/6 is less than 1/2. What about fifths? Well, I couldn't have a fraction that was 2.5 fifths, but half of 5 would be 2.5. So I know that 3/5 is greater than 1/2. So 3/5 is the greater fraction. So let's remember to add benchmarking fractions or comparing them to 1/2 and looking at fractions that are 1 unit fraction away from a whole to our strategies that we can use to compare fractions.